Okay, Packers just got a double dose of good news that we will talk about in this video. As you all know, a couple of days ago, the Packers re-signed Isaiah McDuffie. To my chagrin, I didn't want Isaiah McDuffie. I thought it would have been a perfect time to move on from him, re-sign Eric Wilson, then see what you get in the draft or via free agency or both, right? Having depth is always a good thing. As we know, injuries come and go throughout the season. So having depth there is never a bad thing. But to throw the money we did. Now, we didn't break the bank, sign Isaiah McDuffie, but be that as it may, the Packers get a double dose of good news. So we'll start with the fact that the Packers re-signed Brandon McManus, which I absolutely love. That was going into free agency. I said, man, the one guy that the Packers really need to retain and sign is Brandon McManus. Bryden Gutekunst gets it done. He's now the 11th highest paid kicker in all of football, which isn't bad. That's not bad. They signed him to a 3-year deal worth $15.3 million and then a $5 million guaranteed bonus. So McManus signed with the Packers. Now, we all know we had PTSD from between Carlson and Narveson. The Packers desperately needed some consistency at the kicking level, whether it was extra points or just field goals out there. And Brandon McManus, day one, was against Houston, and he had that game-winning field goal. We all loved that moment because we're like, okay, finally, we've got our kicker in Brandon McManus. Now we got to retain him. Brian Gutekunst gets that done. Since October, he made 20 of 21 field goals and 30 extra points. He tried in 11 games with the team. He had signed with the Commanders last March, but then was released because of sexual assault stuff going on. I think that stuff is behind him. I believe the off-field stuff is behind him. But the good news for the Packers is that they're able to get this guy 3 years, $15 million. That's a good contract. Again, he doesn't become the highest paid kicker out there. He's about on par. He's middle of the pack as far as his contract goes. So I absolutely love that signing. So what's the double dose of good news? Well, the Jets have moved on from Davante Adams. Okay, so how is that good news for the Packers? Well, it says right here now, the Packers are heavily favorites to sign Davante Adams. And leave your comments. Let me know. Do you want Davante Adams back in Green Bay? Keeping in mind, he's 32 years old. Okay, so he's getting up there. He's aging. But it's becoming more and more apparent and evident as we approach the 2025 season that the Packers desperately need that number one guy. And Jaden Reed can take offense to Josh Jacobs going out there and saying that. Same thing with Dontavian Wicks, but those guys have got to step up and catch some balls. Davante Adams would certainly provide the level of consistency that the Packers are desperately needing. Let's take a look at their depth chart right here. You've got Dontavian Wicks right there, Romeo Doubs. And here's the most intriguing thing for me heading into the offseason for the Packers is number one, the cornerback position, which we're going to look at here in a second. But then number two is the wide receiving room for the Packers. And then number three would be edge rushing. The Packers have got to get their wide receiver weapon solidified heading into 2025 because Christian Watson, he's coming off of a torn ACL. He's not going to be active until halfway through the season. And then at that, they're going to have to catch him up to speed and injuries. I foresee, I'm not a psychic, but I foresee a hamstring injury following once he returns, and no fault of his. It's just he's going to be rusty. He's going to be coming back from that torn ACL. He's going to be favoring that knee. All of that. So you can't really even count on Christian Watson until very late. If the Packers make a playoff push, which they very well should make that playoff push. So that's when the Packers could really probably get to about a 90% of Christian Watson and what he'll be able to bring to the table just in time for the playoffs. But they absolutely need that number one wide receiver because you got Romeo Doubs there. So Romeo Doubs, he took that mental health day, which, everybody needs that every once in a while. So Romeo Doubs took that mental health day, but he just didn't seem, he was great. When he came back from that suspension, he looked absolutely brilliant and good. I just don't think his heart is in Green Bay. I really don't. I think he thinks he's that number one or two caliber type wide receiver. He just isn't a number one guy. Number two, yeah, you can make the argument Romeo Doubs is that number two guy, but for him to not really be all in Green Bay. I think the Packers should be using Romeo Doubs as trade bait, whether they get draft capital for him. I think that's what the Packers absolutely need to do with Romeo Doubs. I just am not sold on him. So then that leaves you're out Romeo Doubs potentially, depending on what Brian Gutekunst decides to do with him. And then you're left with Dontavian Wicks, who had very inconsistent hands this last season. And then you're left with Jaden Reed, who I absolutely love. He's brilliant, and the Packers have got to re-sign Bo Melton there. So you've got Jaden Reed, Dontavian Wicks, Romeo Doubs, and then you get a Christian Watson back late in the season. So the Packers absolutely need that number one caliber type wide receiver in Green Bay for Jordan Love, for Matt LaFleur's offense. And I think that Davante Adams certainly answers that piece of the question of Packers need a number one wide receiver there. Davante Adams is going to do that for you. He's not going to be that deep ball threat. I think Dontavian Wicks can provide that deep ball threat that Jordan Love will need. And then you've got Romeo Doubs, Jaden Reed, one of the best slot receivers in the league. He just needs to hang on to the ball, and I think he'll be able to correct that this offseason. And then imagine having Davante Adams, and then once you get Christian Watson back near the end of the season, that's going to be a wide receiving room that's certainly to brag about. And whether or not they retain a Romeo Doubs or not, that's going to be the question mark there. So the second part of the intriguing piece to me this offseason is going to be the cornerback position, because I don't think I see a world where Jair Alexander stays in Green Bay. There's just too much that has been said between both parties for it to seem like they can salvage anything there. And the Packers are going to absolutely desperately need, if he stays, Jair Alexander needs to take a pay cut, and it needs to be a restructuring of sorts. I just don't see that happening. I think the inevitable, the writing's on the wall for Jair Alexander to be moved out of Green Bay. And I don't even think it's going to come via a trade. I really don't. I think the Packers are going to wait till June 1st and get that $17 million in cap space, which then they can go out and sign somebody big, get Murphy from Minnesota, and then address the cornerback position in the first round of the draft. Perhaps, I mean, that would be a great thing for the Packers, or even the second round. And there's a lot of guys that we'll talk about in another video, but leave your comments. I think the double dose of the good news for the Packers is that they're able to re-sign Brandon McManus. I absolutely love it. That was the piece heading into free agency that I said they absolutely needed to do. And then Davante Adams is now cut and released from the New York Jets. Where he goes, I don't think Brian Gutekunst is going to want to pay Davante Adams a ton. So he's going to have to be willing to, get paid less than he would from another team. So is that going to be important for Davante Adams to end his career in Green Bay? How important is that going to be to play alongside Josh Jacobs, a familiar face that he when he was with the Raiders? Leave your comments, and as always, go Pack Go.